Now, it's that time of the month again where we get our very special guest into the studio, Ambassador Yunyo Chol, to have a chat about what's going on around this big old world of ours. And I tell you what, it's been a hell of a month since we last saw each other, hasn't it, Ambassador? How are you doing today?
Right. I'm good, but the world is watching Ukraine.
Yeah.
So I expressed my hope last month that we would not be discussing Ukraine again, but the war still rages on in its fifth week. So let's take a look at the status of the conflict and think about the implications for the world.
Yeah, please do. Update the listeners out there on the situation there at the moment with the war.
They may have read all the news on the Korean newspaper, but here we go. Russia has increased bombardment on a few cities to push Ukrainians to surrender. Particularly, you remember Mariupol, the city on the Black Sea, has been under siege for weeks without food, water, and electricity. The city has a strategic value of bridging Donbass and the Crimea. The Russians actually caused an outcry for bombing a theater with a sign on the ground, "Children" in Russian, "Дети." So it was so inhumane. And Russia also has pressed Kiev and Kharkiv from the north and Odessa from the south, and also bombed Lviv close to Poland to cut the supply route from the west and to warn Poland. But the heroic Ukrainian resistance is now pushing Russians back and has retaken Irpin and raising the possibility of a possible Russian defeat. Russia asked not only China but also North Korea for help, not the other way around.
Right.
This definitely is a sign of desperation, but also of dangerous moves, because Putin raised his threat by putting his nuclear forces on high alert and firing Kinzhal hypersonic missile to neutralize Ukrainian military installations. Next, Russia may use chemical or biological weapons with the deteriorating situation. President Biden and many world leaders are now calling Putin a war criminal on what his troops have done to civilians. Biden is visiting Europe this week to keep them in unity, sharing important intelligence on Russian moves. But he went a little too far when he said Putin cannot remain in power, his usual gaffe. And the United States had to clarify it is not seeking regime change in Russia. So the longer this war goes on, the more difficulties Russia is expected to face. The morale of the Russian soldiers is very low, as they had been sent there without knowing they would be in a real war with their Slavic brothers. Now, the supply line is a big issue for Russians, which somehow favors Ukraine and the West, which has a better ability to resupply and rearm. And internally, anti-war sentiment in Russia is on the rise, despite tight control on information. Around 15,000 people have been arrested for anti-war demonstration. And Marina Ovsyannikova walked into a live news show with no war sign. Now, Putin needs to make a definitive blow or find a settlement.
Yeah, it is an interesting point right now, isn't it? You've got the gaffes from the American side, but that's what Biden does. He's prone to a gaffe, isn't he?
Right.
But more importantly, looking at the Russian side of things and how the public there are viewing this. And look, the guys on the ground, obviously the Russian soldiers, they're having their own problems, and it's not something that you can imagine they really do want to do. When you say Slavic brothers, when you're talking about Ukraine and Russia, you're in many cases talking about literal families split up here. You know, these guys are trying to bombard Kharkiv, places like that, and they're, you know, some of them are thinking, well, I've got cousins who live in Kharkiv. right? This is a very difficult situation for them, and they can understand why morale would be so low. Add into the mix here, it's not just Russians and Ukrainians fighting now. We've got foreign soldiers on both sides, yeah?
Right. The notorious Wagner Group, the mercenaries used in the Middle East and Africa, is joining the Ukrainian theater, along with Chechen and Syrian units. Russia needs them not only to reinforce the regular army in numbers, but also to fight Ukrainian troops without compunction of Russian soldiers as fellow Slav or Slavic brothers,
Right.
and not to count them as official Russian casualties. This is another sign of Russia's frustration and desperation. A pro-Kremlin Russian media last week accidentally revealed the casualty number and quickly deleted it, but it is now in the open: 9,861 deaths and 16,153 injured. That's quite a lot.
Right.
While NATO is not putting its troops in Ukraine, there are also around 20,000 foreign volunteers from 52 countries coming to fight on the Ukrainian side, just like the International Brigade during the Spanish Civil War in 1936.
Right. Yeah, look, it's getting more and more complex now when you add into the mix those foreign fighters as well. The sanctions have been the main, well, almost been the only thing that the West has done to help Ukraine at the moment. How do the sanctions work on Russia? There were words on the imminent default of Russia itself. But, did they manage?
Well, when the sanctions were put in place, including denial of access to SWIFT, the international financial messaging system, and freezing of the Russian overseas assets, Russia seemed to be doomed to default on its payments of interest for its bonds. When Russia floated the idea of making payments in Russian rubles, the West sneered at them and took it as a sign of another desperation, which could be the first default since 1917 revolution. But surprisingly, Russia managed to pay those interests on their bonds. With the money it has stashed in the secret bank account in Switzerland. It's not from the Russian government's chest, but of Putin and oligarchies' personal accounts. The Swiss Bank Association even revealed that Swiss banks have $213 billion of oligarchies' wealth. So such payments will have to continue in the coming months. Russia also managed to defend the value of its currency ruble with a combination of regulations, but we will see.
Right. Well, that's hitting some powerful people in their hip pocket there to stop the country from defaulting. So I don't think the West will be feeling too bad about them paying that money because it won't last forever, although it is a lot of money that they've got there, yeah? Mm-hmm. But the sanctions have also, in some ways, backfired and had a negative impact on the global economy as a whole, haven't they?
Right. Russia's economy, per se, is not a big problem because it is slightly smaller than that of South Korea and a tenth of China's.
Right.
But Russia is also important as producer of vital commodities such as oil and gas, food, and metals. Russia is the world's third largest oil producer after the United States and Saudi Arabia, and its largest exporter. The United States and United Kingdom, who are not so dependent on Russian oil as Europe, have banned import of Russian oil, but Europe is still debating that option among them. The U.S. is trying to encourage its shale oil industry and other countries like Saudi Arabia and even Venezuela.
Yes, an odd one, wasn't it?
To increase their oil production to help stabilize the oil price. EU's energy trade with Russia in 2021 was $108 billion. So it is urgent for EU to stop financing Russia's war efforts with this trade. now the U.S. has decided to provide LNGs for Europe while U.S. and Europe accelerate their work on alternative energy sources, including nuclear and renewables. A more serious issue is food. Russia and Ukraine together produce about 30% of wheat of the world and other major staples. With the sanctions, Russia's customers in the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia will be badly hurt, like Egypt, my old home, in their food supply. And Russia and Belarus are world's biggest fertilizer producers, and its shortage due to sanctions will also reduce food production in many countries.
Right. So, although the economy itself isn't that big, they are a very vital part of the international food chain. Just as we've seen there, not to mention the oil and other natural resources they've got. Then, how is Korea responding, or South Korea particularly responding in this situation?
Well, on March 7th, Russia announced a list of unfriendly countries, which includes Korea. Korea suspended its export of strategic items at the end of February and followed up with further financial sanctions on the 1st and 7th of March. President Biden mentioned Korea among the allies joining the U.S. efforts on Russia during his State of the Union speech. Even the victory in the recent Korean presidential election of a conservative candidate who is very much committed to the alliance with the United States is expected by the West to help their pressure on Russia with Korea's vital high-tech and semiconductors. And Korea's president-elect also had a phone call with President Zelensky.
Right. So we talked earlier this week about the possibility of refugees coming to Korea, but they are coming in spades out of the Ukraine, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a very tragic humanitarian crisis, but also is a big problem for Europe on top of its energy dependence. So the official UN number is 3.6 million refugees out of Ukraine into neighboring countries, but roughly 10 million people have been displaced from their own homes.
Right, and that's internal problems that they've got there moving around the country. A lot of people out of their homes, out of their towns, and just sort of wandering to look for safety. So Ukraine and Russia, we've seen them on TV, and with peace negotiations. How have they been going?
Well, they just wrapped up the latest talks, the fifth round of peace talks, this time in Istanbul on 29th, Tuesday, with the hope for a direct face-to-face summit between Putin and Zelensky. With the current military stalemate, they need a mutually acceptable settlement. Russia recently announced that the first phase of the operation had been completed and that it would reduce offensive on Kiev and concentrate on Donbass. But the United States and the West await Russian action, not words. On the other hand, Zelensky will have to let go of his dream of NATO membership and accept neutrality in return for some international security guarantee, as I mentioned last week, while Russia asked for easing of Western sanctions. But the heart of the matter, the real question would be the future status of Ukrainian areas under Russian control. Because the Ukrainians still insist on sovereignty and territorial integrity. So Zelensky feared this possible partitioning of Ukraine, and he compared it to the division of South Korean Peninsula into South and North Korea. Well, we need a creative formula which Ukraine can swallow and feel safe, and Putin can declare as a victory to his own people to save his face, and most importantly, keep him from making any further reckless moves. He talked about nuclear and chemical. As they say, the Russian economy may be collapsing, but so many Ukrainians are dying on the ground.
That's the thing, isn't it? So then, over in our part of the world, obviously China has been watching this. What's their position on their Russian request for help then?
Well, I think this is the most important point about this war in Ukraine.
Right.
China initially was aghast to see Russia's invasion. Traditionally, China is firm on the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity and non-interference of domestic affairs. Mm-hmm. China can also read from U.S. posture on Ukraine how serious the U.S. would be in honoring its commitment to defending Taiwan.
Right.
And the United States repeatedly warned China that there would be consequences if China provides any help to Russia. In terms of economic calculation, it is safe for China to refrain from helping Russia and stay in the global financial and supply system, which has benefited China so much over the last decades and is so essential to its continued growth in the future. But from the strategic point of view, China may think it will gain from any loss of ground by the United States, its arch rival, whatever the economic cost may be. Further, China may hope to purchase Russian oil and gas at a lower price in return for its help, and may even have access to the Russian technology, state-of-the-art technology in advanced weaponry. So I guess China must be going through a serious internal debate now. But China has to think twice, because if China takes the second path of helping Russia, the West cuts China out of the global supply chain, and China and Russia will have to create their own economic ecosystem, maybe with allies like North Korea.
Right.
But it would not be enough to allow sustained growth of China, which is so vital to the Communist Party's rule over China.
That's the thing, isn't it? Strategic objectives against economic objectives in China, and those two are conflicting over this war in Ukraine. So, then what is all these implications? A very complex situation for us here on the Korean Peninsula.
Well, it can be seen as a regional conflict that we have seen so many times, but it can also be an inflection point of history by which we will mark the end of 30 years of globalization after the Cold War, and we may go into so-called post-Cold War era with a new global strategic as well as economic landscape, probably divided into blocks. Such changes will no doubt affect South Korea, who used to sit on the fourth line of the Cold War in the 20th century, but thrived thanks to the right alliance and right policies. Now, the new incoming Korean government should make a sober long-term strategic assessment of all the new developments and set its course on a firm footing. Well, our attention-starved North Korea has tested the latest ICBM and is also known to be getting ready for a possible nuclear test. In the middle of all this chaos.
Right.
Why? Maybe next month, I hope we will stop talking about Ukraine and discuss the new Korean administration's foreign policy and security strategy. So let's keep in touch.
Hopefully for the folks in the Ukraine, yes, we'll have something else to talk about next month. As always, folks, if you do want to listen to the entirety of my interview here with Ambassador Yoon Chol about the situation in Ukraine, you can go to the website at gfn.or.kr. Ambassador, it's always a pleasure to have you in here and get your insight, and we'll catch up with you again next month.
Thank you. See you next month.